Dr. Zac Seidler, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on. Now, you are a clinical psychologist. You're an associate professor at Melbourne Uni, and you're also the global director of research for Movember. Now, anybody who's in Australia and probably New Zealand knows what Movember is. But people in the UK and the US may or may not. It's kind of global now, isn't it? So, but talk to our listeners about what Movember is, and why it started, and your involvement in it.
For sure. Hence the global in my title. I hope that the your Irish and UK and US listeners are onto it. But yeah, I'm very lucky to work for the Moustache Factory. We're in our 21st year actually as a men's health organization, which is pretty wild. Yeah. So begun in around 2003, a couple guys in a pub hanging out going, where did moustaches go? What's going on there? They'd been working as ad men and creatives, doing a lot of breast cancer campaigns in that era, which was very, very big in Australia at the time. And really, they started to go, who's talking about our health, our well-being? Some of their mates had suffered with mental health issues. Their dads had prostate cancer. And so they started in earnest with a couple. There was probably 20 of them. The month of November, they said, all right, who can grow the shittiest moustache here? Let's see how we go. And they brought them back. This was before, hipsters, every man and his dog was growing a moustache for fun. And I just look like Borat when I grow one. But the way in which it kind of moved really organically was, it started out, with a couple guys raising some money. They tried to share it with a couple of prostate cancer organizations who were like, who are you? Fuck off. This isn't happening. And then they came back the year after and they'd doubled the amount that they'd raised. And suddenly everyone started to, their ears started to prop up. And we went from strength to strength to the point where over the past, 21 years or so, we have raised over $1 billion.
Wow.
As a men's health, we're the largest men's health organization in the world. We operate in over 20 countries. We've got around 400 staff. We've got offices in London, in LA, in Toronto, in Melbourne. And we, have now moved beyond purely the practical joke of growing moustaches to really changing the face of men's health. We are fundamentally investing in thousands of programs in, disadvantaged communities, in mental health, in prostate cancer, in men's health more broadly, just trying to actually galvanize the field and put money into research and programs.
Mate, that is incredible, and I feel rather embarrassed because I'm clearly not up on how.
But that's the point. I'm here to
November.
just blow people's minds. That's the fun of it.
Yeah,
we're sneaky. This is sneaky grassroots stuff, Paul. We don't want to put it in everyone's face. It's so important that this is by the people for the people. It's not about being showy.
Yeah, because I'd spoken to the Movember guys pre-COVID about actually coming in and doing a talk for their staff, and it never actually happened. And I knew then that they were growing, but Jesus, I had no idea just how much legs it has actually got, and that massive expansion around the globe. That is bloody awesome.
It's pretty cool, eh?
Yeah. So tell me, what drew you as a psychologist to start to focus on men's health?
So yeah, I did obviously end up post PhD and masters at Movember, and I can talk about that journey. But the reason I kind of got into men's health, I was really, really focused on masculinity as a, pretty much in like high school, I was really interested in it. I got two older brothers. We got a pretty competitive household, and I was like a drama and music nerd, and I also played soccer. And so I constantly was like shifting between hanging out with the girls and hanging out with the guys. And I felt myself.
Just a quick one. It's football.
There we go. I know. I'm just trying to read my audience here, mate. I would normally say football. I say footy, and then people are like, "You've never played AFL in your life.
Yeah,
what are you talking about?"
That's right. Yeah.
So I chameleoned my way through high school, really, just trying to fit in, belong, have mates and not be bullied is pretty much how most guys, move through the world. Don't hit me. And as a result, I think I started to learn to like be able to read situations and read how people were responding in certain situations. I got really, really invested in understanding how people respond, what their stories are, what drives them, what their fears are. I was a pretty weird kid, I guess. And being a third child, I think that kind of happens. You pay attention to dynamics in strange ways and try to peacemake and all of that type of stuff. And so moving through, my dad was a medical practitioner. I had a lot of interaction with at-risk populations. He worked in Sydney's King's Cross. There was a lot of, heroin addicts and homeless people. And I would go in, once a week and work with him as a teenager and just be thrown in the deep end. And so I just had a lot of interaction with a lot of different people and a lot of different stories. And so psychology kind of, I was really drawn to it as a profession. But as I started in my undergrad, I was one of, a handful of guys in that degree. And there were like 2,000 people there and just lots of girls. And most of the guys who were there were just there to pick up. Like, that's kind of how it went. So I was like, I can actually, if I stick at this, I think something's going to happen here. And so I put in the time and I loved it. And I stuck with it. I was at uni for like 9 years. And throughout that journey, I just realized that no one was talking about men. No one was talking about masculinity. I was, the only guy pretty much in my master's course where I was seeing clients, and I just kept seeing these guys come in and drop out. I kept seeing them be misdiagnosed. I kept seeing this glossing over of men's diverse, nuanced, intricate, beautiful lives. And so I just went, this is a bit broken. And so my PhD just started to really open up that door and be like, why aren't guys seeking help? What does this look like? And eventually it became pretty clear that lots of men are seeking help. Heaps of guys are going to therapy, but they're just not talking about it, or they're not getting what they actually want.
Yeah, right.
And so I spent quite a bit of time actually then pivoting towards what happens on the other side of the door. What is taking place in therapy that is not hitting the mark? And that's how I kind of ended up in Movember. I sat down and had a discussion with the executive director there where I was like, you keep creating a movement that is getting guys to open up, to be more vulnerable, to have these conversations. But you're not checking what happens on the other side. You're not making sure that when they are vulnerable, when they are open, that someone is ready to listen. Because inherently, there's just this belief that the system will work. And that's just not the truth. Like many times, men slip through the cracks. Women do as well. And so I pretty much, sold to him, we need to make sure that clinicians are ready, that the system is ready, and we need to actually adapt to men's needs. And so that's what Movember, embraced me, and I became part of the team like 6 years ago. And from strength to strength, I've been able to take over our research team, which is now in a number of different countries and looks at not only systems, it looks at masculinities, it looks at social media, it looks at all of these different things that are going on in men's lives and goes, how can we talk to them about what's happening, and how can we actually offer them something that they want, not what we think that they need?
That's really interesting. There's a couple of things I want to jump into there. I want to talk about the whole masculinity piece, and that word is almost becoming synonymous with toxic today, and especially because I got a 14-year-old boy. It's like, what do we tell these guys about? Because I'm hearing a lot of, I'm having Oscar coming home from school. There is in school, there's respectful relationships, which you're probably aware of. For our listeners, this is a program throughout schools. And it just seems to be, at least through what we're hearing from him, this is how men are bad, this is what not to do, this is how not to behave, and nothing around talking about values and virtues and how you should behave and what good masculinity actually looks like. And it's driving lots of men away. You'll be aware of this more than me, and they're going into the manosphere and listening to wankers like Andrew Tate and stuff like that, right? So, so what can we do, particularly with those emerging young men who are going through their teens? They're trying to find out their place in the world, and they're just getting bombarded with all this negativity on one side and all these dickheads on the other side saying, hey, come in here, I'll show you something.
100%. So, wankers like Andrew, that's a great quote. We'll take that one out. But I think that something that is so important is, as you said, they are trying to work out who they are. They're going through, and we all remember that identity molding, that extreme discomfort of like trying to work out who I am and where I belong. You need not only role models, you need messaging, you need structuring and scaffolding, you need a process that provides you with growth opportunities and provides you with a sense of aspiration and future orientation. And the messaging at the moment is devoid of that. It is filled with this mentality of what not to do, what not to be, and it's a deficit-focused view, which, for all intents and purposes, despite the fact that there is a lot of harm that goes on, we cannot excuse the fact that, you know, men and boys are doing some bad shit across the globe. But we need to find a way to lean into the good, to exemplify the good, to talk about the fact that there are silent heroes all over the place. You know, this idea that there are incredible role models in dads and teachers and grandfathers who are never on the front pages. It's just the dickheads who are on the front pages of the paper, who take up all of our airtime. And that's where toxicity comes from. So I have a fundamental issue with that term, as you would expect. It's very harmful. It's not useful. It does not provide any structure for young men to adapt their behavior. All it does is says, here is a blanket ban on this thing that you have inherited, and you now have no ability to change that at all. Like if it said there are toxic elements to the way in which masculinity is socialized and you should try and consider this, that's a different ballgame. But the media will never purport that. The narrative is just like, this is broken, you're all fucked. That's kind of how it looks at the moment. And that type of problem orientation without any solutions is exhausting. It's degrading to young men. And fundamentally, my main concern with the topic is that it does not make anything better. If we are afraid of violence against women, calling men toxic will not fix that. That's my issue. And so I'm really focused on building up young men and showing them what is possible and providing them with a manifesto of health and well-being, rather than letting them be driven into the arms of these guys who have a really clear doctrine of life that is, do this, do this, do this, date this woman, make this money, buy this car, get this job, and it's all about power and domination. And it is fueled by men's insecurity and this feeling that they are constantly pressured to achieve something, when in fact, really what we should be doing is going, hey guys, life is very scary. It's tough. It's uncertain. But here is a path that we can all walk together.
Man, I love that, and we need a lot more of that. It's one of those things, and we see it so much, right? Is that there's well-intentioned programs that then are just misguided and have lots of unintended consequences. And as you rightly pointed out, the unintended consequences is pushing men towards all the wanker sphere.
Wanker sphere. But I think that the thing is that they're well-intentioned, and the one way that you can ensure that they are going to actually hit the mark is by co-creating them with the audience. Sit down with the 14-year-old boy and go, does this pass a sniff test? And they're going to be like, no, that sucks. That's boring. That's stupid. Why are you talking to me like that? I'm out. And then you go, all right, maybe this won't work.
Yeah, and you know what? It's really interesting because my wife sent an email to the school that Oscar's in exactly around that, saying, "Where are the workshops? Where are you talking to?" Because Oscar's coming home and going, they're talking about guys thinking this of girl. I've never thought about that in my life, and it's almost
A
like
self-fulfilling prophecy.
there's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and suggestibility, right? And Oscar's going, "Gee, that's so weird," and he's coming home going, "This shit's weird."
Why don't we assume that these young guys, and I always say this about the manosphere, which I think is really important, that young guys, and we've got so much research on this, they don't go in with misogyny. They leave
Yeah.
with it. They leave with it. They don't go into these classes with misogyny. They sit there, they hear all of this stuff, then they end up in this, shitty banter with their friends because they're now being force-fed content that seems at odds with their values, and they leave with these ideas, that are pretty dark. And so I think that what we should be doing is going, here is an offering for us to say to you, we believe that you have inherent goodness. We believe that this is what's possible for you. Let's help you get there. Let's provide you with the path, rather than here is the badness and we're going to assume that this is who you are.
Yeah, yeah. You need to rewrite the curriculum on respectful relationships. That would be a big step forward. I'm absolutely serious. I think one of the things, because I've been thinking about this a lot, right, particularly with a 14-year-old boy, is the lack of in the West a rite of passage. I mean, I think that's pretty huge. I interviewed a doctor. His name escapes me just because my head is full of PhD and book at the minute. But he actually was a medical doctor. He saw a lot of problems with boys and went and did a whole heap of research. And so all around the world, in many traditions, a rite of passage for teenage boys to bring them into manhood. And he's saying, that is missing in our lives. In the Western world, and actually has started this movement on rite of passage, which is, I think, brilliant. Have you any exposure to
Is
that?
that Anna Rubinstein?
That's
Yeah.
Anna Rubinstein.
For sure.
And I apologize,
No,
Anna.
we got there.
It was a brilliant podcast.
Yeah. So no, I know Anna's work really well, and I think it's important. I don't know if you've heard of the Man Cave, which is a organization that goes into schools and does young men's programming. We fund them at Movember. We consider ourselves like the big brother of the men's sector. There's also Top Blokes, and there's Tomorrow Man, and there's the positive masculinity movement. There's a lot of different school-based programs that are trying to do this type of rites of passage in different ways, because some of them are shorter, some of them are actually camps that are longer. It has taken off, and I think that we should also point out that the rite of passage movement is a beautiful, in many ways, indigenous tradition. And, going back to country, for instance, is something that you hear about so often. Adam Good spoke about it when he was going, through the horrible experiences that he was as copping all of that racism in the AFL. He went back to country to try and, reconnect. And that's something where you start to access your identity. Access who you want to be and what you want, your life to look like. We've lost sight of that. And do I think that we need a really structured societal process for young men to move between boyhood and masculinity and manhood? Maybe not. Do I think that there needs to be a clearer discussion about how that period looks, who needs to show up, and what success looks like? Yes, fundamentally. And the rite of passage as a concept, I think, is essential in many ways, because women go through it biologically. They have a literal turning point where they go to womanhood pretty quickly, and that happens mind and body for them. And there's a lot of conversation around it. Thankfully, now there didn't used to be. We have gone from a point where there probably used to be far more discussion for young men as they moved into that in manhood towards this. Let's not in a way wake up the beast. Let's not have that conversation. We don't want to point at that. We're just going to hope that it works out. And I think that pluralistic ignorance, in some ways, that idea that if we just shy away from this thing and don't look at it, it'll just work out has really fundamentally failed, rather than going, we need to structure this. We need to make sure the boys have a sense of belonging. They have a sense of community values. They have a sense of service and altruism. And when I talk about masculinity, people always go, you can't define healthy masculinity. All we can do is define toxic. And I was like, I can define healthy masculinity. It's focused on leveraging masculine traits flexibly, which is that things like service, altruism, fatherhood, generative fatherhood. There are lots of different things that exist. Stoicism and self-reliance in the right dose are extremely useful. I know you think, long and hard about hardiness and grit and toughness. All of this stuff, when applied effectively in the right time, at the right place, that is healthy, positive masculinity writ large. And we should not shy away from having those conversations.
Yeah, 100%. Let's now jump over and talk about therapy. So you have done a lot of reading and research into the area of gender-sensitive therapy and why some traditional therapeutic modes might not work as well for men. So just talk to us about that. And is there an element, because you mentioned right at the start that in your master's, you'll be the only guy. And I remember at university, psychology was the vast majority were females. Has that influenced the way that therapy's done and therefore is not the best approach for men, or is there many other things that play? I'm sure there's quite a few things that play into it.
Yeah, there are so many different things at play. I think the fact that the vast majority of people who come to therapy are women is probably more of a factor than who is offering it. But, amongst psychologists, it's about 80% are women in the profession.
Wow. Wow.
And I actually don't think that is anything other than a marketing failure. Like, it's a damn good job. Like, you've got, especially in this day and age where everyone is being replaced with AI, I think I have pretty good future aspirations to exist as a therapist. I'm not being replaced anytime soon. And, you have stability, you get paid pretty well. There's just this belief that it's women's work. And I think that that's a serious issue within our society, that type of sitting in someone's distress, in someone's life, for a moment is not considered to be men's work. I hope that we're going to see a shift and that more men are going to get into it. It's not because women cannot treat men. Let me be really clear. Women are just as good at offering therapy to men as men are. It's just that more choice is always better. You want more gay therapists, more Indigenous therapists. You just want, greater, diversity so that someone can always see someone who they want to. I think that that's really important. Yeah. But when it comes to the therapeutic model, you'd understand that it's very much focused on emotional communication and vulnerability. Two things that are like fundamentally at odds with the way that we're brought up as men in many ways. Yes. Also, it's like, sit down and let's have an hour-long face-to-face conversation about your deepest, darkest thoughts. Talk to me about your mother and your sex life. And every guy is like, damn, that is not where I want to be right now. And there are some, thankfully, who are into it. And there are many who are not socialized to that experience. And it's very uncomfortable and foreign and unaccommodating in many ways for them. And so what I try to do and what this training that I've created through Movember with my team is called Men in Mind, which is like, how do we actually get therapists to upskill, to realize that when men come into therapy, they have a lot of beliefs and expectations and attitudes and biases that are going to stop good therapy from happening. Also, you as a therapist have a lot of beliefs and attitudes about men. You might be reading God knows what, and you've got toxicity running through your brain, and then a guy all tattered up comes in, and you've decided that he's a shit bloke.
Yeah.
And the issue is, as we said before, you end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy where he's only going to show you what you're looking for. And so the aim is to open this up. That's what the aim of this training is, which is to be like, let's actually make masculinity not just some commentary bullshit that we're reading constantly in our opinion pieces, but rather let's go beyond adolescence, the show that everyone wants to talk about, and actually look at what is at the core here of this guy's distress, which is often the way he was brought up, the pressures that he has, the stress that exists in his everyday life. And when I talk about the fact that therapy is in many ways a contradiction with masculinity, it's because many of these guys don't have mental health issues in the stereotypical sense. What they do have is situational stresses. They have financial distress and uncertainty. They have, stress around unemployment. They have relationship difficulties. The number one risk factor for suicide in this country is not a history of depression. It's past 6 months separation.
Really?
It's breakup. Breakup is the greatest risk factor for suicide. So if anyone has a mate who has just gone through a divorce, those 6 months are like crucial for jumping on and offering support and services for guys. But we don't see that. We go, oh, he's not depressed. This all happened out of the blue. It didn't happen out of the blue. This stuff is so important that we realize that things look and feel different amongst many guys. When they get depressed, for instance, there's a subgroup of men who don't go into this like sad, crying, worthlessness hole. They go into anger, irritability, and drug and alcohol use. They go into externalizing. They send all of their distress out onto the world. And it looks like men behaving badly. It looks like shit behavior. But in many instances, it is a cry for help. And we just need to get more attuned and sensitive. That's what gender sensitive treatment is being attuned to the fact that if this guy was brought up in this way with these parents in this world, he is going to respond to his internal experience in this way.
It's a really interesting point, and it's actually made me think about stuff. I actually have 3 mates who are in that category in my sort of large social group, and there's a bunch of us making a concerted effort to get around them, but does this play into? I just had a thought that the biggest risk for suicide is my age group, middle-aged
100%.
And is a chunk of that because of that tends to be the age where there are separations and divorces, and then men are not dealing with it well.
Bang
is
on.
that a
Bang
big
on.
factor
Yeah.
in it?
So the divorces tend to happen, at 40 to 50. Like that's where most divorces take place, and that's where the suicide rate is at its highest. Yeah, that 44 to 55-year-old age bracket, it's dire for that group. And no one actually gives a shit about men in the middle years. Like it's just not a concern. Everyone is very focused on young men, as they should be in many ways, because they are the future of our society. But when you look at base statistics, we need to pivot to start to focus on these guys, because what happens is that there is a long-term suppression of emotion. There is a long-term breakdown in social connectivity. The number of friends that those guys have drops off a cliff. Yeah?
Yeah.
And so you're very lucky that you've got the vast majority of guys who are in that age bracket who have kids have very few people to call on when they're in a time of need. And so they get to divorce and their whole social scaffolding is gone. They literally don't have anything to stand on. No one is there to wrap around them. Their wife created all of the social events for them.
That's a massive thing, isn't it? Is that most of the social stuff is driven by the wife and their friends, and then when the divorce happens,
vacuum
people choose,
yeah.
and the guy's left on their
own. Of course, because he's done no fucking work. Do the work. Why is it that this is women's work? And this is the thing. Women don't want to do that. They don't want to arrange everything. You don't need to be hopeless at this stuff. It is, and they say this to guys all the time, this is fundamentally life-saving for you. You can go and have as many ice baths as you want, but if you don't have any mates, you're done. It is essential that when you're 18, when you're 25, when you're 30, no matter how important your job is, if you do not spend time on your social connections, your life expectancy will drop. Like, that is the thing that keeps guys alive. You look at the Harvard longitudinal study, consistently, the only guys who are alive in their 90s, regardless of whether or not they smoked, what their diet was, what their exercise was, the ones who had quality relationships are still alive. That is essential, and that is why when you get to your mid-40s and you have a separation, you don't have any friends around to call on when you're in a time of need, you have extreme shame around all of this that you have no vocabulary to describe, and you have stigma around going to therapy, or the therapist doesn't connect with you. It's a pretty bad situation. So we just need to do a lot better at not only empathizing with those guys and providing them with structures. We need to make sure that they know that there are so many like them out there, and that they can connect with one another, because all they want, all of us want all the time, is this sense of connection and belonging. And so when guys go, oh, I don't want to pick up the phone and call a guy, I seem needy, you know, that's always, I don't want to be vulnerable, I seem needy, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, mate, I know that all you want is to hang out with him. So like, we need to move past that shame response that I might look weak for asking for something, when in fact your values are telling you, I need this. This is important to me.
Do you know, one thing I often talk about in my talks is the Hanoi Hilton prison camp in Vietnam, where they had something called the TAP code. And I interviewed Lee Ellis, who spent 5.5 years in that prison camp. And the TAP code was a way, when they were in solitary confinement, they could tap on the walls and the pipes and communicate with each other. And the research shows that is the single biggest predictor of PTSD and suicide in combat veterans, is whether or not they have social networks that they use. Right?
I'll tell you something. You know, I gave evidence to the Royal Commission into veteran suicide, and everyone was kind of perplexed about the fact that the suicide rate is so high in veterans. But I tell you when it's so high. It's not when they are active servicemen. It is when they return. It's always when they return. And I'll tell you why. Because they have a sense of purpose, meaning, and belonging. And then the carpet is ripped out from underneath them. And they go, who am I? And where is everybody? And that's literally what happens when men just get into their 40s. They go, wait a second, I was having fun. All my mates were around. And I actually didn't water the seeds. I did not help my social life grow because it wasn't a priority. You need to make it a priority. I sound like I'm preaching here, but it's something that is so fundamentally simple and is so disregarded. And I think that this notion that like masculinity, going your own way, being your own man, is absolute bullshit. We are human beings, and the way in which masculinity flourishes is when we are in tandem with other people.
You're preaching the correct palm, and actually, my wife. So, because I'm ex-military, right? Spent 8 years in the British military, and then moved over to Australia. I didn't know anybody, and just dove into work and building my career. And my wife one day said to me, "You need to go back and start playing football again." and she was actually
they always know. They always know.
Me, and yeah, exactly. She knew. She absolutely knew. And it was definitely the best thing I'd ever did, right? Because it's now this whole group that are around soccer, and even though we're not playing anymore, we're still hanging out and talking and supporting each other. How much of just to come back to the therapy thing, how much of this is that men normally, if you're gonna generalize, lots of females have face-to-face conversations. They catch up over coffee and they sit and they talk face-to-face. But with men, a lot of it's shoulder to shoulder, right? In the pub, watching sport, chatting and stuff like that. How much of that plays into therapy? Because therapy is that face-to-face, which us men are not as accustomed to in general.
Exactly. So there are two things here. The first is that men are not beyond face-to-face conversation. So we should never do this thing where we're like, we have to completely adapt everything because they can't do it. It might take longer, and so you build in systems that are going to get you to that end point. But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater and be like, men can't sit down and have hour-long conversations because we're right here doing that. Yeah. So
Yeah.
not true, but it does take longer. It is more uncomfortable. It is more stressful in many instances, and it's extremely foreign. And so for those guys who do more of that shoulder to shoulder, I think what's really important is that that doesn't need to go away. That can exist within the therapeutic setting. And this is what I try and teach in this program, which is that just because you decided as a clinician, yeah, or you were taught, actually, I was always taught, and I was reprimanded if I did anything different during my master's, that you must sit in these two chairs, they must look the same, you must be at this angle, you must ask these questions. When I'm doing an assessment, I have to, have my clipboard, blah, blah, blah. Very quickly, I was like, fuck this. Like, this is not happening. I went to Darwin for one of my placements, and I was working with young Indigenous kids, and it's like, if you attempt to do any of that with them, you're done. Yeah, and it's a baptism of fire to really learn that very early, which was great. But what I do is I do what is necessary to get to the same endpoint, which is to say, I've had ping pong tables in my therapy room. I've had pool tables. I've played Call of Duty with young guys. Like, when their hands are busy, the ability for them to open up is profound. And so this is what I mean. The end point of interest is around openness and vulnerability in whatever way it looks. How you get there, do not decide that it has to look like this. And so I think that our therapy, I've done running therapy, there's adventure therapy, there's equine therapy. There are so many different modes that are opening up. They're considered like crazy offshoots, but really what should be considered crazy is the fact that we've decided that these four walls, this is how you're going to talk about your trauma. Like, wild. And so I threw out the clipboard because I was like, if I can't look at him or if I can't be there with him, he thinks I'm a robot. And my first 2 sessions or so, I'm not going through his entire family history chronologically because he doesn't talk like that normally. I talked to him about surfing for 25 minutes and how the waves were this morning. And then in the last 10 minutes, he dumps because he's calm, he's relaxed, he's been able to be a human being. So just do what works and ask him what he wants. And if he doesn't know, co-create it with him.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I actually know somebody who was struggling, really struggling, went to see a psychiatrist who sat behind a desk quite far away from them with a clipboard, just firing questions at him, and then just gave him a selection.
For 11 minutes and asked for $500. But this is the thing. It's like the system is broken. It's not any one individual who's going to be able to change this. I can only see however many people I can. That's why I'm trying to create system change, because we need our training programs at our universities. We need our, practitioner regulation stuff. Like, it's not unethical to do treatment in a way that's going to be beneficial, but they've created such strict bounds that we've ended up actually shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, mate, I agree. My wife's going through a master's in counselling, and it's so bloody rigid, some of this stuff. But I think you become the artist.
You find your way.
Don't
exactly.
You? Yeah. So let's come back to the suicide thing. I remember my dad telling me. So he lives in Ireland in an area where there's a lot of farmers, and he said when Ireland, which is one of the last countries in Europe to bring in the drink driving laws with full force, he said male suicides in farmers went through the roof. And he saw it in his area because these guys, a lot of them were single. They work really, really hard. And then a couple of times a week, they drive into the pub and have a few pints with their mates, sitting shoulder to shoulder. And as my dad described it, that was their church. And then when they brought in the drink driving laws, if they had like more than a pint, that was it. They were done. They'd lose their whole livelihoods. And he said they just stopped coming, and suicides massively spiked. So that comes back to your early point about that men need those social networks. So we all need the social networks, but we're not as good at them as females. What other? So you talked about the importance of that in suicide prevention. what other approaches are promising in the suicide prevention space?
For sure. So we've been working at this for a long time, and it's really central in some ways because my thesis was really focused on depression whenever I did that when I was a wee boy, and it's funny how when you talk about men's mental health, you get dragged always into the pointy end of suicide. It always goes there because it seems that that journey and all of the other distress that kind of sits in the middle, it's only the crisis that people are willing to kind of deal with. That's where they want to focus much of their attention. When it comes to prevention, it is about those early times. It's about getting on this stuff around social connection, around relationship health, fundamentally, around making sure that they understand what rejection looks and feels like. This idea that we can't be in control and powerful and dominant of our relationships, and in fact it's a push-pull always, and it will not always go your way, and learning how to regulate our emotions. I would say that is the one thing that we are really struggling with as men, is our emotion regulation. Everything kind of comes back to a sense of shame and failure, I think, for many guys, which is that I couldn't do this, I couldn't be this, I couldn't achieve what I thought was necessary. And there's all of these woulda, shoulda, coulda things. And this ability to go in your own mind, actually, this is what's happening right now. This is what I need to do. This is how I need to calm myself down. This is how I'm going to talk to myself in a way that's going to soothe me and help me move past whatever this feeling is. Instead, what happens is that feeling comes up, and it is fundamentally intolerable for many of these guys because they have not been given the code to be able to actually respond to it. And so you go from a 12-year-old who is, pretty suspended for showing emotion in class rather than sat down and spoken to about what he's feeling and thinking. And then he's an 18-year-old and he's drinking and drug taking, and a girlfriend's just broken up with him, and there's just seemingly no way for him to overcome this feeling because it's just too much for him. To the 30-year-old who's just had a kid, and now he is suddenly in this new world, and he has no ability to understand the extreme stress that he's feeling about being a protector and a provider. It goes on and on and on. And at some point, it just becomes too much for some people. And so what we need to do is get on it early, but it's also never too late. Like, there are ways, I've worked with 60, 70-year-old men who have so much trauma about things that happened to them, early on. And the thing about the Irish, which we're, so lucky to learn from, is this poetry, this storytelling, this ability to, make light of pretty dark situations. And I think us men need to find a way to realize that is deeply masculine, to make meaning of what has happened to you. To describe it, to corral those internal pieces and actually regulate those feelings rather than try and push them further and further down with more drink, because like alcohol is a huge thing. It's extremely social for many guys. It's the thing that, gets them out of the house, but they don't seem to have any flexibility in, like, I can do other things with my mates.
Yeah. And I think that's where that's where sport, golf, soccer, whatever, really comes to the fore. But I wanted to just come back to something you kind of started talking about this, and I think it's kind of endemic of our whole healthcare system, is that we have a sick care system, not a healthcare system.
100%.
We wait until people are screwed, and then we try to treat them. And in the medical model, there's a lot of drugs, as in psychology, a lot of drugs that have limited effectiveness. So if you were czar of the universe, right, what would you do? What sort of things would you implement, and at what age? And I think we've talked about some of them along the way, but just you've got that magic wand now. Where would you start, and where would you go?
I don't want this Trumpian power, but what I would do, I think, is I would totally agree that I would focus heavily on health and well-being. I would focus on, like, you don't remember any of the arithmetic that you did at fucking school. Like, none of that holds. You need a certain amount. You need the building blocks. And then we need to focus on life skills. We need to focus on our emotional inner worlds in a way that is not feminized, that is not at odds with the way in which we're brought up, but is actually directly tied to our sense of self. And so doing values work, doing rites of passage, doing ideas of spending a period, a month, at school going, who do you want to be? Not what do you want to be? Not, I want to be a firefighter. This is always the thing that everyone is asking kids. What do you want to be? It's who do you want to be? It's and how are you going to get there? And it's not about this aspiration of, I need to be a CEO, I want to be an entrepreneur. That's what's killing us. It's this idea of achievement rather than that hard work of self-determination and growth, And so what I would focus on is building up those core skills around making sure that our communities are actually interlinked and tightly bound in ways that they used to be for our grandparents, where people would have neighbors that they would talk to, God forbid. Like, I don't know where that went,
Absolutely.
We can talk about tech and social media. Like, there's a whole thing going on there which is harming everybody and is leading to serious brain rot and an inability to actually be in the present moment. And anxiety is going through the roof with that as well, let alone pornography and all of these other situations which are really harming men. Pornography, gambling, alcohol, seriously undermining men's ability to show up for themselves and their families. And that leads to this spiral, And so if I am the czar, I am focused really heavily on connection, on understanding your emotional experience and being able to discuss and describe it, and making sure there are some schools that, that I've worked with where every boy sees a psychologist once a month. We should have a public school system where I don't want to see you when you're sick. I have no interest in that, because when you're depressed, I need to actually get you out of bed. I need to get you going to work. That's not therapy. Therapy is building you up. It's creating that resilient scaffolding so that you can continue on. When you're down in the dumps, that's not where the work happens. And so it's really important that we actually see psychology as dental care, preventative. Once every 6 months, give me a checkup, check my gums,
Yeah, no, that is very powerful. Is there anything that Movember are doing in this space?
Yeah, so
because this is the stuff that I'm really passionate about. Is like how do you head this off at the pass, and how do you give people a guide, a scaffold, as you said, to live the good life? And actually, just before I finish the question, I think, I'm not religious. I'm a recovering Catholic from Northern Ireland. I've been in recovery for 40 years, but I think part of the overall problem is the breakdown of religion, although I'm not a massive fan of it, because it gives people a set of values and a guide for how to live, but also a community. And then you're taking that away, and people need to then go and do the work, particularly about what sort of a person do I want to be, what sort of values do I have, and if you don't have anybody steering them, then often that is outsourced to social media and these tribes on social media that can become really destructive. So, sorry, but that turned into a rant as well as a question.
The moral fabric, when you had really clear institutions that provide a community, there were Scouts, there's Rotary, there's Church, there's all, and they all fell apart because they were all corrupt. And this is the issue. How do we create safe male-only spaces as well? How do we create places that are actually going to not be abuses of power, that are not going to be corrupt, and that are actually going, because there was a lot of health that came with that. There was a lot of benefit. It just so happens that we actually unraveled all of it rather than some of it, which I think is problematic. But what Movember is doing, we've got programs all over the globe, and we fund some of the school-based stuff. We fund a program, and we created it called Ahead of the Game, which is a sport mental health and resilience training. And so we're partnering with the AFL on this at the moment, and we're actually partnering with Gaelic football as well in
right.
Ireland. And what we do is we go into a community club. This is not elite, it's at the grassroots, and you go in and you give a program on understanding and responding to your own mental health issues and building up resilience in these young guys. But something that we do that is so important is that we also train the coaches and the parents, because you have to have the ecosystem. Because what happens, and this is something that I'm learning a lot of in the violence prevention space as I do more of it, when you go and you tell a boy at 13, this is what you need to do to be a respectful man and how to not be misogynistic and violent and whatever, if he goes home and his dad is beating his mum, none of that matters. Build an ecosystem of health and well-being and safety for a young kid, and he will feel like he exists within a place that makes sense. He exists with rules that he can follow. He exists with a aspiration that he can achieve because his coach and his dad is playing the game with him, So that's, one really key program that we're rolling out across the globe. And I continue to spend most of my time with my team researching how we can get this no-do gap being a bit shorter. So knowing and actually implementing. Because at the moment, it's just like ivory tower. Let's all sit up here and churn out PhDs, and they don't go anywhere. My team, who all have PhDs, are fundamentally obsessed with translation. And I need to make sure that when we find something, it gets into the hands of guys quickly.
Yeah, I love that translation and closing the knowing doing gap. I talk about that all the time in health behavior change, right? Because a lot of people know what they need to do, but they're not doing it.
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences. I know we've got limited time here, but I remember talking to Professor John Reed, who's done a lot of research in this area, and said that psychologists and therapists, and surveys that he did, only 25% of them ever asked somebody about whether they had adverse childhood experiences. And he's like, they are the biggest driver of mental health issues. What's your thoughts on that, and how and when do we intervene? And how is that different from somebody who hasn't had those adverse child experiences that are setting up their view of the world?
Well, when we talk about upstream and downstream, we've spoken about prevention and how we're going to get ahead of this stuff. Nothing that we do is going to be more important than dealing with ACEs, with adverse childhood experiences. It is the bedrock of mental health issues, of violence in our society, of basic trauma that is leading to personality difficulties, that is leading to alcohol and substance misuse. And we have it rife within our society, and no one is willing to look at it. So whether it is violence in the home, whether it's child sexual abuse, which is rampant amongst young men, and nobody is willing to call this out. It is so common, and it is having such untold effects across the lifespan. If we get onto this stuff early, if we are willing to say we need to focus on our young people, we need to focus on children fundamentally and safeguard them from this stuff and build services for them so that we can actually nip it in the bud, so that they're not the 40-year-old man who is now perpetuating violence because he knew nothing else. There are so many ways that if we get onto this stuff early, and we actually say, this matters to us as a society, to expunge this behavior and to make sure that children can live safely and happily as they should as children, and to not stigmatize them when they enter into a service with stuff like this, because that's what happens. They come in and they're just too complex, their behavior is too disordered, etc. I really think that that is at the core of our future success here, is going to be how we actually respond to child maltreatment.
Yeah, and it's a big, thorny, wicky problem, I think, as is the whole mental health stuff. But mate, you and Movember are treading an awesome bloody path. So I tip my hat to you, and I tip my hat to the organization and the massive growth of the organization, because God, is this needed? It is just so needed. So mate, thanks for everything you do. Thanks for everything your organization does, and thanks for sharing your knowledge on the podcast. I could just speak about this stuff for days, but I know you've got to go. But mate, that was bloody awesome. Thank you.
I'll be back. Thanks a lot, Paul.